Okay, bear with me for just a second. Sometimes we all have trouble sleeping at night, so you grab your phone and try to find a nice, relaxing YouTube video to watch. In my case, I searched up top 100 licensed video games of all time, and all I found in the results were top 10s, short videos around 10 minutes long. So I decided then to get up and make a whole ass new channel at 5 a.m., subsequently spending hours writing, recording, and editing clips of 20-year-old video games. Seems reasonable, right? Oh. Well, when you think of a licensed property, what do you think of? Usually I think of a TV show I like, or a comic, cartoon, movie, action figure, whatever. Something you enjoy as it exists already as its own thing. Then they take something else you like, in this case video games, and make a mediocre game about it? Sign me up! Why? Well, all because I couldn't find a top 100 licensed video games list video to get sleepy to one night. And with that being said, here's my top 50 licensed video games of all time, because 100 is difficult and I'd rather work half as hard and twice as smart. Besides, you might be asleep already by number 25. While technically licenses, I won't be including any sports or wrestling games in this list. Additionally, no tie-in games with multiple licenses. Also, I won't be including any games that came out after 2021 because I'm not a time traveler. Yet. Before we get to the list, here's a few dishonorable mentions to show you what happens when licensed games go so wrong. Picture this. It's the year 3030, and you're wandering the desert in search of food and water. You know civilization once existed here, long ago. As you feel the soles of your feet burning in the sand, suddenly you stub your toe. You wearily look down in disbelief. Surely this is just your brain suffering from dehydration. It's a hallucination, right? This thing in the sand? This illusion? It's clearly nothing more than a mirage. You reach down, and shockingly, you pick it up, holding it in your hands, something genuinely tangible. In disbelief, you rub your eyes, but this object is truly here. It is E.T. for the Atari 2600, a game that was so bad, thousands of unopened copies were literally buried in the Arizona desert in the mid-1980s. Slowly, you raise the cartridge to your mouth, but in disappointment, you have to admit, this game is not good as food. It's also not good as a game either. It's just not good for anything. Now, I can't prove that Where's Waldo for the NES is responsible for my vision deteriorating over the years as I get older, but you also can't prove it's not. Somehow, I did beat this game as a child, but looking back now, it's one of my biggest regrets. How the hell is that Waldo? Shaq Fu is certainly a video game, I'll give it that. And nobody can ever take that away from it. Based on everyone's favorite Christmas movies, the Home Alone games were ported to just about every console under the sun. Which would be great if the games weren't so bad. The developer, Bethesda, seems to be doing okay these days, though. Kicking off our list at number 50 is South Park: The Stick of Truth. Despite there being 5 prior South Park games before it, Stick of Truth is often considered the first one that doesn't make you want to stand really close to Kenny. Stick of Truth is genuinely funny, and it's a quality game even if you're not a huge South Park fan. As evident by the fact that some other lists put this one in their top 5 licensed games of all time. For me, it's sitting here comfortably at 50, but regardless, it's certainly a fun playthrough. Stick of Truth spawned a sequel in The Fractured But Whole, which made a few improvements to the same formula, and just barely misses this list as well.
Here it is. The reason why humans and elves are locked in a never-ending war. The Stick of Truth.
I initially had this spot reserved for one of the several excellent Tiny Toon Adventure games for the 8 and 16-bit systems, but at the last minute, deep in the mine cavern, I suddenly remembered Mickey Mousecapade for the NES exists. A brutal platformer shooter hybrid from Hudson Soft, Mousecapade had enough variety, challenge, and straight-up weirdness to keep me entertained for hours as a kid. Some stages are exploration-based in nature, while others are more hold-right, run-and-gun blitzes, while others are essentially mazes, presenting a challenge far above what most games should probably do if they're going to be intended to play mostly by children. You're able to control both Mickey and Minnie simultaneously. Well, really you're in control of Mickey, but Minnie kind of just follows your lead, which is a bit weird at first. But if you know what you're doing, you can pull off some pretty cheesy strategies, as Minnie is essentially immortal, with only Mickey taking damage, reducing your life bar. An interesting relic of the 8-bit era, I simply couldn't disrespect our favorite rodent couple by leaving off Mickey Mousecapade. No, it's not the definitive James Bond game, but 007 Nightfire is well worth a look if you're a fan of the secret agent who prefers his martinis shaken and not stirred. While the game is primarily a first-person shooter, there are several driving levels that offer a nice change of scenery and offer some variety to the gameplay. After several Bond outings post-Goldeneye were either mediocre at best or disappointing cash-ins at worst, it's nice to see that developer Eurocom put some respect back on Bond's name with Nightfire. After years of comic-looking, family-friendly X-Men games, Activision decided two things were missing from Logan's story: blood and more blood. A solid hack and slash from top to bottom, X-Men Origins Wolverine nails the presentation aspect and is a game that you can really sink your claws into. Never change, Wolvie, never change. With their newly launched system, the Nintendo 64, having just hit the market with only a couple games up for offer a few months ago, Miyamoto and the boys must have been thrilled to land a Star Wars license game. After all, Luke, Han, Leia, R2, Darth Vader, Jabba the Hutt, and Yoda are all insanely popular characters and... Oh, what's that? Oh, none of them are in this game. Well, despite that, and in spite of the fact that the game kinda handles like a shopping cart with 3 broken wheels at times, it's still pretty fun, particularly the flying stages, and at least Shadows does still have the sexiest character in the universe, Boba Fett. Made by NetherRealm Studios, the twisted, sick geniuses behind the Mortal Kombat series, Injustice is a DC fan's paradise. Boasting a robust story mode, the game's quite a lot of fun if you're playing solo, and of course a blast if you're playing with a friend as well. Considering the theatrical state of the DC universe lately, it's nice that someone at NetherRealm gave these characters a well-deserved creative reimagining and some love. The game was enough of a success to get a sequel in 2017. Toy Story for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo is a very interesting game. It has plenty of flaws, and yet its strengths shine, showing that it's genuinely deserving of a spot on this list. Between the platforming, collectathons, driving stages, boss fights, speedruns, and stealth stages, it's clear that Toy Story has a lot of variety to offer. Add to that, for, at least at the time, pretty incredible graphics, unless you're playing on the Game Boy version, and you've got yourself a genuine cult classic 16-bit video game. Developer Traveler's Tales went on to develop not only the sequels, but also several other Disney games, the LEGO series, and a few Sonic games as well. The Simpsons Game for Wii is an underrated gem of an entry to this list. Despite the Wii being underpowered even at the time, as well as the mechanics often endlessly tied to motion controls, in some cases for the better, but mostly for the worse, The Simpsons still managed to create a wonderful 3D universe for you to explore. Even better, it was a co-op game, so you could bring a fellow fan of the Yellow family all the way through Springfield with you as you progress through many iconic locations from the Simpsons universe, solving puzzles, beating baddies, watching well-crafted cutscenes, and platforming your way all the way to the finish as you try to beat up God. Sure, Homer. You do you. You always have anyway.
Is someone there? I don't have any money.
God, it's the Simpsons here. You've been playing with our lives and, we'd like you to stop. Our town, family, and friends are all suffering.
Yeah, God, you used to be cool.
Just because I'm a gamer doesn't mean I'm not cool.
Next up is an N64 shooter based on a spy action thriller movie series that's been popular for decades, but it's probably not the one you might expect. Regardless, Mission Impossible is a truly enjoyable game, despite some, at times, pretty apparent flaws. The game was ported to PlayStation a year after release with some newly added voice acting. Who could forget blow darting a woman in the bathroom and then sucker punching another guy and just dumping them off in the 2 stalls? The 90s were a bit of a different time, there's no denying that. Often forgotten compared to other classic games that take place in the TMNT universe, the Turtles GameCube outing is nonetheless a fun adventure. The comic-inspired graphics aged well in my opinion, and this 3D hack-and-slash platformer is worth a look even today. As its 2020 remaster, Rehydrated, has shown on modern consoles, Spongebob Battle for Bikini Bottom has always been king of the 3D Nickelodeon platformers. Despite some mixed criticisms, the open-level style collectathon is still a fun way to kill a couple of hours. Is the game perfect?
No! This is Patrick! I'm not a crusty crab.
The award for first franchise to appear twice on the list goes to Star Wars. When I first played Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi for the SNES as a child, I thought the game was confusing, unnecessarily difficult, and kind of complex. And while all of these things still remain true to some extent today, it can't be denied that this series has its own style, feel, and excellence. I've decided to go with Return of the Jedi specifically for this list from the Super Star Wars series, as I think it's slightly better than the Episode 4 and 5 outings also developed by LucasArts and Sculpted Software in the early 90s. Give this one a try if you want a challenge, but don't say I didn't warn you. Based on everyone's favorite Christmas movie, Die Hard Arcade is largely forgotten about in this day and age of gaming. This is partially due to the fact that, while it was ported to the Sega Saturn, just a month later, Die Hard Trilogy hit the much more popular PlayStation 1. Despite Arcade being made by Sega, Trilogy also hit the Saturn later that year as well, and in many fans' minds, probably eclipsed the greatness of Arcade. And that's fair, honestly both games are very good, but if I had to give the edge to one, for me it's Die Hard Arcade. The game's plot has very nearly absolutely nothing to do with the movies, but somehow it works. This is also one of the very first games I can remember with QuickTime events, something that at the time blew my little gamer mind right there in the middle of the arcade. It felt like I was playing a movie. A 2002 game based on a 1982 movie, The Thing is an underrated third-person survival horror shooter released for the PS2, Xbox, and Windows. In addition to being in the unique position of having 2 decades pass between the time that the source material came out and then the game's release, it's also notable for its interesting fear system. Playing off the fact that the creatures out to get you in The Thing are shapeshifters who can assume human form in an act of deception, in addition to watching your own back, other characters in the game will actually be distrustful of you. Depending on your character's actions, the level of trust from NPCs can fluctuate. If their fear level gets too high, they may attack you, attack other NPCs, or even kill themselves. Oh, that's kinda dark. The game received mediocre reviews when it released, but is something of a cult classic these days, in a way similar to the movie. Coming out later in the N64's life cycle, when most developers were working on games for other systems, this is a surprisingly fun and somewhat deep racing game. In Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, you'll need to manage your pod racer with upgrades and repairs, as each race is a constant struggle between wanting to boost your way to the front of the pack, but knowing if you go too fast, you'll likely bump against some walls or other racers, causing damage that you'll then need to fix. While admittedly, it may not have aged quite as well as the definitive racing game for the N64, Wave Race 64, The re-release in 2021 proved this game still has some charm under the hood. Or in the pods, wherever the engine is on these things. Batman Returns is a very, very solid beat-em-up starring the Caped Crusader. In some ways, it plays it a little safer than Batman for the NES did, but for the time, it was a polished and atmospheric experience. It also breaks up the pace with some Mode 7 Batmobile-based stages. The chief drawback on this one for me is the lack of multiplayer. It would have been so much more fun if you could have your second player Robin by your side and beat up baddies together as you go through Gotham. Though I suppose it wouldn't really make much sense considering the movie that it is based on. Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie, is the official game of the Peter Jackson King Kong movie. The game plays a bit like Turok on steroids. It comes with some unique game design choices, notably an almost complete lack of HUD on the screen, meaning the player can't see their own life bar, nor a map, nor even a crosshair on screen to help them aim. This game really goes for an immersive feel throughout, with excellent audio, both music and sound effects, and for 2005, very well acted cutscenes too. Then again, it is Jack Black, and if you expected anything less than greatness from him, then you're probably watching Saving Silverman. After the success of Shadows of the Empire, LucasArts decided to move in a bit of a different direction with Star Wars Rogue Squadron for the N64. Released exactly 2 years later, Rogue Squadron took the best of Shadows, in this case the flight stages, and flushed them out into a full game. I'll admit perhaps Rogue Squadron hasn't aged the best of any game on this list, but it was a blast for the time, and if you want to play a modern equivalent, a sequel titled Squadrons was released in late 2020. I haven't tried it myself yet, but I'm hoping to soon, and thanks to the goodwill the Squadron name has for me, I'm sure it'll be fun. Based on everyone's favorite Christmas... No, I'm just kidding. Chronicles of Riddick, Escape from Butcher Bay, is one of those rare games whose legacy has almost succeeded that of the film. It's certainly reviewed better than the 2004 sci-fi movie starring Vin Diesel. To be honest, the film isn't even that bad. After all, it does have Dame Judi Dench in it, but it's a bit goofy. The game, however, puts on a more serious tone, often resembling Metal Gear Solid 2 or 3 in some of the stealthy sections. Of course, you wouldn't be Vin Diesel if you didn't eventually open fire on anything and everything that moves. Another game whose music and sound design as a whole is just a highlight. Butcher Bay received an up-res version in 2009 that still looks pretty solid over 12 years later. Perhaps one of the most controversial games on this list, some will love it and some will hate it, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for the NES is still an impressive game to me nearly 35 years after its release, despite some blatant questionable game design choices. Known around the internet mostly for its high difficulty, and despite some notably bad platforming sections, the game is still enjoyable to me to this day. A million little details make this one fun despite the frustration. Things like managing your turtle party as a unit, rotating your current choice based on their weapon as well as their life bar remaining, the great sound and music, the fun boss fights, and the crazy weird enemies that I didn't recognize from the cartoon made slicing and dicing your way through each level a blast. Well, most levels. No, I've still never beaten it and probably never will, but so what? At least I wasn't playing the PC port, which is actually impossible to complete due to a mistake when recreating the sewer portion midway through the game. Scott Pilgrim. If your life had a face, I would punch it. Initially a comic IP, though heavily influenced by gaming to begin with, Scott made his way into cinemas backed with a fantastic cast of actors and actresses, only to flop hugely and become a financial failure. Later then to become a cult classic, an inspiration to many, Scott Pilgrim finally found himself in a video game only a few months after the movie hit theaters. Later taken down from all platforms for reasons we can only assume including an expired license, which is a peril unfortunately that all games on this list potentially face in one way or another. Luckily, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, was resurrected in 2021 for the Switch and PS4. While not my absolute top favorite co-op side-scrolling beat-em-up of all time, Scott Pilgrim the game is undoubtedly a very solid experience from start to finish that also encapsulates its world, no pun intended, better than most licensed games ever made. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't quickly mention the incredible soundtrack by the great band Animaniacs. The only downside? Bread still makes you fat. Carbohydrates. Similar to The Thing, The Warriors is another video game adaptation that didn't come out to play until decades after its source movie was released. So in that sense, this game kinda came out of left field for many. But in another, it feels right at home on the PS2 and original Xbox. Coming out just a year after San Andreas, the game was developed by Rockstar, the same team behind GTA, as well as the Max Payne series. It's also clear the developers of this game wanted this universe to really evoke the atmosphere of the movies, and they did so to the best of their ability on the current hardware. The Warriors is a 3D beat-em-up punctuated by some very well-produced cutscenes and voice acting, and is worthy of a spot on this list, so check it out if you get the chance. He is the terror that flaps through the night. Often overshadowed by another duck-based series on the same platform, Darkwing Duck for the NES is nonetheless a cult classic in its own right. Influenced by the half-dozen mega-popular Mega Man games for the NES, Double D's first ever game sees you shooting, jumping, and quacking your way to victory as you traverse across 7 stages of classic 8-bit platforming action. While the NES version is clearly superior, the Game Boy version boasts some pretty impressive graphics as well, all things considered. The age-old question for fans of classic cartoon mallards has often been who's better, Daffy Duck or Donald Duck? But for me, my heart always belongs to Darkwing. Listen, I struggled where to include this one on the list. It's undoubtedly a great game, yes, but it is basically Turtles in Time, the remix. Still, it comes fresh out the kitchen like a hot, delicious anchovy pizza. There's a good chance if you grew up with an SNES, you preferred Turtles in Time. And there's an equally good chance if you grew up with a Genesis, you preferred Hyperstone Heist. Regardless, both are high-quality games that Konami puts a lot of love into, and they're still fun to experience with a friend even now, regardless of which system you choose to kick shell on. Even back in 2004, the time of the release of Battlefront on the PS2, Xbox, and PC, the Star Wars franchise had already seen roughly 75 different games across various genres step foot within the galaxy far, far away. Despite that, developer Pandemic Studios managed to create a game that had its own feel and unique value in Battlefront. Rather than taking control of just one Jedi or pilot, Battlefront puts you in control of an entire faction, one of 4 actually, each complete with 5 different character classes as well. 1 part shooter, 1 part strategy game, Battlefront lets you, and a friend as well, experience massive battles on a scale which felt so huge for the time of its release. It even had online compatibility in a time when most licensed games didn't. Is it the best Star Wars game ever? Admittedly, no. But Battlefront is undeniably a very forward-thinking game for the time, one that's aged way too well, and for me, it's still enjoyable now. Dividing our list down the middle at number 25 is Simpsons Hit and Run, a game where you usually drive down the middle of a street and various pedestrians run to avoid being divided in half themselves. A blatant ripoff of the Sega hit Crazy Taxi, Hit and Run was a bit of a surprise smash hit back in the day, and its fan base has only seemed to grow since then in a way. It's a genuine cult classic, and it might not be the most original game ever produced, but it definitely creates an amazing atmosphere as you pick up various fares from folks around Springfield, including timeless characters like Professor Frink, Snake, and Grandpa Simpson. What felt like, at least at the time, an endless amount of sound clips from all my favorite characters really helped add to the experience and make this one so fun to play. The Magical Quest series, which is actually a full 16-bit trilogy, though some of the games took some time to be ported westwards, is definitely a series geared more towards children. The difficulty is fairly low, In fact, it's the first game I rented as a kid that I beat in a single weekend, returning it back to Blockbuster having experienced almost all Magical Quest had to offer. I'm sure my parents were thrilled to have paid a mere $5 instead of the usual $60 it would take to buy the game outright. Hey, I'm starting to understand why so many 8 and 16-bit developers found the need to make their games so darn difficult. Looking at you, Super Star Wars. Despite the fairly low level of challenge, though, this game is still a classic for me because it's just straight up a blast. I chose to list the original here, as it's the most, original of the trilogy, all of which allow for Mickey to transform into multiple different costumes with different powers, not all that different from Mario games of the same era. As our favorite mouse traverses his way through some very well-designed and unique stages on his quest to stop the bad guy, Pete, from, being a dick? It's not too heavy on plot. But give this one a try if you're into retro platformers. You can probably beat it in one sit-down, and it'll just take a couple hours, and you won't be disappointed. Sometimes a game comes along where you only need about 20 or 30 seconds between loading it up and realizing you're about to experience something special. The Walking Dead by Telltale is one of those games. The cel-shaded characters still look magnificent. The dialogue and voice acting is so wonderfully produced that you'll feel attached to the characters regardless of whether you're a fan of the show or not.
It's just me.
Telltale really pushed the boundaries of what we expected from storytelling in video games. And for that, it's clear that this game belongs at least in the top half of this list.
How is beating a kid to death gonna help anyone?
This is your fault, and you damn well know it.
I'm giving Back to the Future the slight edge over The Walking Dead because 1, it came out first, and 2, I prefer its cinematic universe to that of The Walking Dead's. Sorry, zombie fans, but let me know when Rick Grimes' mother tries to get in his pants, and then we'll talk storytelling. Seriously though, Telltale Games revolutionized what we expected from plot-driven experiences in the realm of games, something that had been sorely lacking for some time, in my opinion. The fact that they used a legendary IP like this one, albeit from a decade and a half before the game even released, is just icing on this sweet, sweet plutonium cake. It's a shame that this company went defunct in 2018, as their many fans looked forward to whatever else they might have been cooking up next, myself included.
I'm not sure I like where this is going.
Are you sick of Star Wars entries yet? If so, you might be a scruffy-looking nerf herder because Fallen Order is honestly wizard. Following the very popular Dark Souls formula, publisher Respawn Games, creators of Apex Legends, clearly poured a lot of love into this game. Released in late 2019, many of the cutscenes are immersive enough to make you feel like you're part of this universe, thanks to really well-made graphics, voice acting, and sound design. Many Star Wars fans across the globe eagerly await Fallen Order's sequel, slated for late 2022.
Classic.
Sick of Turtles entries yet? If so, you might be a bummer. I'm sorry guys, please don't leave, the list is just getting good. Because the Manhattan Project is another awesome entry to this list. Unquestionably, it is a bit of a black sheep when it comes to the TMNT franchise, but that's in no part due to the game's quality. Released in North America in 1992, this game came out a few short weeks before Turtles in Time hit arcades, and almost 6 months after the Super Nintendo had already hit shelves stateside. Yes, the Manhattan Project is similar to TMNT 2 in that it's another co-op beat-em-up starring Mikey, Donnie, Raph, and Leo, but it manages to separate itself in several ways. Each character has their own special ability, each stage has its own identity, and the story is fleshed out over several well-made cutscenes, considering we're talking about a game on an 8-bit platform. Will TMNT 3, The Manhattan Project, go down as one of the general gaming public's favorite Turtles games of all time? Probably not. But if you've never played this game before, and you're a fan of the Turtles, or even the beat-em-up genre, this game is 100% worth your time to seek out and play. Ask anyone born in the 80s or 90s, but there was a time when the names Ren and Stimpy were iconic, household names, albeit infamously in the case of most of our parents. The Nickelodeon cartoon pushed the boundaries of acceptable daytime TV with its gross-out humor and crass jokes, tiptoeing the line and occasionally even falling straight over it. And lucky for us, it spawned more than a few video games in the process. The best of those games, in my opinion, is Stimpy's invention for the Sega Genesis. While it is on the shorter side, the game will probably take about a half hour to beat if you know what you're doing. It's still chock full of the same humor and personality that endeared so many fans during its initial run. Play through this one with a friend, and you'll each take control of either Ren or Stimpy, each having their own idiosyncrasies and mannerisms as you progress through the game, collecting the parts needed for Stimpy's Mutate-O-Matic machine. Far from the most polished game on this list, Stimpy's invention earns its placement all the way up at 19 with good old-fashioned, weird 16-bit charm. One of the most underrated games I know, X-Men for the Sega Genesis, is a cult classic in some circles, and if it only had a few more tweaks and improvements, probably could have been a classic to all. The game hits you straight in the face right off the bat, making the most out of the Genesis sound chip on both the title screen and the intro cutscene, which feel very similar to the early 90s cartoon. You're then faced with an important decision, a la TMNT1 for the NES. Which of these 4 characters, each with their own unique powers, will you take into battle first? Of course, fan favorite Wolverine is here to slash his way through hordes of enemies, and the leader, Cyclops, will take charge as needed. But to young me, the real stars of the game were always Nightcrawler, whose special ability is essentially unmatched due to the power that it gives you to skip sections by teleporting, as well as my personal favorite X-Men character, the Cajun Casanova himself, Gambit. Beyond the character selection screen, there are also secondary characters that can be called into action. These are Archangel, Storm, Rogue, and Iceman, who will all lend their hand, and you'll be meeting many more friends and foes across the 6 long and difficult stages. I'm not sure if anyone I knew personally even got far enough into the game to experience this, but one of the most obtuse concepts I've ever seen in a video game comes late into X-Men for Genesis, when you come across a seemingly unclearable section. The only way to progress is to, in the words of the game, reset the computer. This cryptic clue actually requires you to press the reset button on the Genesis itself. Because while pressing the button quickly will allow you to progress further into the game, if you were unlucky enough to hold it for just a second too long, it would reset the game. You know, as Sega, the console manufacturer, actually intended the button to do, erasing all your progress thus far. What a bizarre and genius idea and concept, executed in an outright stupid and probably infuriating way to those who came across it. The only comparison I can think of this, even now, is for the PS1, that being Metal Gear Solid 1, in which you're required to unplug your controller and insert it into the Player 2 controller slot, despite the game only being single player, in order to circumvent your enemy's ability to read your mind or game inputs, blocking your attacks from controller slot 1, but allowing you to hit him from controller slot 2. The Genesis rendition of X-Men spawned a sequel, The Clone Wars, which is certainly an excellent game in its own right. But for me, the first game is the one whose odd charm helped me gain such an affection for these characters as they moved to comic, to cartoon, to movie, to other mediums, long before the modern rendition of the X-Men existed today. Some might be upset, but I've decided to only list one Arkham game here for the purpose of variety, as is the case with a few other series in this list. While you can't go wrong with any of the Arkham games in the trilogy, Arkham City was the peak for me, as it took everything Asylum achieved and simply added more on top of it. Expanding the universe with additional character cameos, the game's scale feels pretty massive, and on first playthrough, the atmosphere as you explore the avenues and alleyways and skies of Gotham will have any Bat fan feeling right at home. And best of all, no annoying Batmobile missions. Hello, nurse. Have you noticed a trend here? The Genesis comes up once again, as the system was an absolute beast for licensed games back in the early 1990s. And there's no better example of that than Animaniacs, a game I rented multiple times as a kid when renting games was still a thing. based on the recently rebooted cartoon of the same name, with the greatest animated title song of all time. Animaniacs lets you switch between Yakko, Wacko, and Dot, each with their own individual powers, as you make your way across puzzle-based platforming stages, most of which are homages on popular Hollywood movies. Of course, given that we have the Warner Brothers, and the Warner sister,
Call me Dottie and you die.
That's Dottie.
I warned you.
there are elements of humor and satire strewn across the entire game. You'll find yourself in an Indiana Jones-inspired jungle, a sci-fi outer space landscape, a Western-themed stage that Clint Eastwood or John Wayne would feel right at home in, and a haunted house with some spooky Friday the 13th vibes, all while getting closer to the final battle with iconic fan favorites Pinky and the Brain. Side note, I highly recommend looking up Pinky No Brain on Spotify for reasons. While somewhat of a simpler game compared to many on this list, Animaniacs no doubt has a special place in the hearts of fans of these, wait, what kind of animals are they again, anyway?
We're not bees and we're not cats or bugs or horses or things like that. What we are is clear and absolute. What we are, dear doctor.
It's cute.
I'm sorry I asked.
Marvel's Spider-Man for the PS4 is the type of video game you'd take on a desert island to play over and over again, web-slinging around the massive city, beating baddies as the big web daddy, and perpetually trying to stop MJ from being kidnapped. It's the simple tale of a boy, his mutated genes, his metropolis, his antagonists, his love interest, and all the wonderment that comes with being an arachnid teen. Call him Peter because Mr. Parker is probably someone more together than him, but the game itself is put together pretty damn well if I do say so myself. Of all the games on this list, Marvel's Spider-Man may not be the most original, but if you want some superhero action, look no further than this modern 2018 classic. Decisions, decisions, decisions. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, or KOTOR as it's often referred, is all about decisions. Will you? Won't you? Jedi? No chill? KOTOR definitely gave the player an extreme amount of freedom when it first released in 2003. This game took a brave step in game design by giving players the choice to unleash their inner Jedi or Sith, and thanks to that, gamers have fondly remembered it and its sequel as top-tier Star Wars games ever since. A great debate for boomer gamers and retro fans alike, which Aladdin is better? The Super Nintendo? The Genesis? Well, I'm here to celebrate both, because both are truly great games, even if the SNES one is better. Released in 1993 by Capcom, while the legendary developer was truly at the height of its power, the Super Nintendo version takes a little bit more of a platformer approach when it comes to Prince Ali's adventure, whereas the Genesis version, developed by Virgin Interactive, focused a little more on combat. While they essentially are two different games entirely, but still very similar, and regardless of which version you're playing, you don't really need to be a retro fan to understand and appreciate the value that Aladdin's 16-bit quests brought to platforming video games. This behemoth of an arcade cabinet absolutely took more than a few quarters from me back in the day, and repeatedly again over the years. If you're a fan of co-op beat-em-ups, you likely already know, but one of the huge draws for X-Men the arcade game was the fact that it supported 6 players on one machine, with gameplay stretched across 2 screens. There was also a standard 4-player single-screen variant as well. So, while 12th is nothing to be ashamed of, why does this rank lower than some other beat-em-ups you might expect a little later in this list? Well, the reason for that is the level design and waves of enemies thrown at you feel a little less unique, a little more monotonous than the cream of the crop. Still, get a couple of friends around an arcade machine with X-Men on, and you're guaranteed to have a very fun time. Probably the first co-op game I ever played Chippendale Rescue Rangers spawned a love of that genre long before I even knew what to call a multiplayer game where you're working together to achieve your goals instead of fighting against one another in some way. With a soundtrack way better than it had any right to be, there was something about Rescue Rangers that simply made you want to play the game all the way through until you reached the end. And then when you beat it, you wanted to play it again since it had multiple divergent paths you could take to your end route. Something that was still pretty darn uncommon back in 1990, outside of the Mega Man series. And when you beat it again, you probably wanted to go ahead and play the excellent 1993 sequel, also for the NES. While I do prefer the original, both games excel thanks to their platforming and unique item-based combat, and show the incredible grasp on stage design that Capcom had in the early 90s, something that many modern game designers will, to this day, still attest to. Whew, okay, we've covered 40 games already, as well as a few embarrassments, but here's a short lightning round of a few games I felt deserved a little share of the spotlight before we crack into the top 10. Narrowly missing this list, Futurama for the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube did a great job of capturing the feel of the show's universe. So much so that it's actually been re-released as episodes of the show in certain anthologies. One of my absolute all-time favorite TV shows with so many timeless, get it, characters, Futurama would probably sit nicely on this list at 51 when all is said and done.
Robot, you haven't seen the last of me unless you die before I see you again, in which case you have.
Rampage for the arcade and NES was truly an excellent game for its time, but it's disqualified because really it's more of a reverse license, something I decided I wouldn't include. So sorry Rampage, or for another example, Dragon's Lair. In 2018, Warner Brothers decided to make a movie about the at the time over 30-year-old game because, well, The Rock prints money. It's gonna be so weird when he's president one day. Another janky mess of a game with an awful camera. Smells like 32-bit era. To me, Jedi Power Battles still manages to be great. I had a ton of fun playing this one in co-op in college, despite it already being a decade or so old at that point, and so I thought it deserved an honorable mention, even though admittedly, I can't call it a good game. The Dreamcast version did have many improvements and bug fixes over the PS1 initial release, but for nostalgia's sake, give me the broken PS1 version any day. Hey, even if you think this is crap, it's still better than Star Wars Connect, right? Chex Quest 1, Chex Quest 2. Because these games came in a damn cereal box. Not bad for a Doom clone and a full day's serving of fiber. There are more versus Capcom games than I can count at this point, and truthfully, all of them are pretty darn solid. A few of them narrowly miss this list, but unless you're a hardcore fighting fan, I don't know that there's enough here to truly separate it in a sea of other 2D-based fighters, at least for a casual player. By far the most difficult game ever made starring a lion. Some of you guys love this one, and for that I just wanted to say, who hurt you? Yes, this game is a license, if you didn't know. The IP initially comes from a board game, and if I'm being honest, I haven't played it yet. And therefore, for better or for worse, the game lands here in honorable mentions. Is that a travesty? Well, I don't know, let me know. But from what I've seen, the game is undoubtedly great in many aspects, but lacking in some others. So I'm not sure if it would crack my personal top 50. One day, I'll play it and find out. Cyberpunk was maligned with launch day issues that had fans fuming initially, and deservedly, as some had kickstarted the game a full 8 years prior, only to find an unoptimized mess on launch day. But still, the game has its vision, and it's inarguably fantastic in many ways. A title that will be spoken of for many years to come.
It is death that has treated you.
Dune 2000, released naturally in 1998, is certainly worth a look if you're into RTS combat games. The game looks a bit like SimCity 2000, but with much better music, and the sound design on this one truly helps empathize the general feeling and isolation present in the Dune series. Yep, another Turtles game. This one probably won't change your life, but considering the hardware it's running on in the year it came out, and how big and nice looking these sprites are, the level design here makes the absolute most of what little meat is on the bone. Plus, I wanted to include a handheld game somewhere. With TMNT Fall of the Foot Clan, you won't not have fun, and that's a semi-promise. I'll be honest with you, nearly each and every single one of the 672,538 LEGO games is fun to play, or at least enjoyable in some ways. However, I didn't feel like any of them quite did enough to make the top 50 list. It also blurs the line of multiple licenses under one IP if you consider the LEGO brand itself, but if I did consider the LEGO brand itself, I'd probably still come to the conclusion that playing with these little inanimate rainbow blocks is simply more fun than playing the games based on them, even if many of them are very solid experiences. Getting back into our top 10, we have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. Well, 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 you knew it was coming, didn't you? Turtles in Time, or Turtles 4, as it's known in some uncultured circles, is an absolute classic of the game in the minds of so many. Released by industry legends Konami in 1991, the game came at the peak of Turtles' popularity and goodwill among kids and fans worldwide. Turtles in Time refined the gameplay from earlier beat-em-ups and other Turtles games, and threw in a healthy dose of time travel to shake things up a bit graphically and atmospherically. The game looked beautiful when it came out. It seemed like it was far ahead of most other games at the time. I'll admit the plot itself is a bit forgettable, but that's basically the case of any game in this genre. While the Turtles themselves will travel between the modern era, the prehistoric age, the Wild West, and the robotic future, if I had the ability to travel through time, I'd probably head straight for the early 90s so I could experience this classic game for the first time all over again. When this game came out in the early 2000s, I'll admit I wasn't into video games the way I used to be. Getting into my teenage years, I'd enjoyed games all my life, but long gone were the days where I'd gaze upon a few screenshots of a preview of a title for 6 months straight in a copy of a Nintendo Power or another magazine. But when Spider-Man 2 hit the PS2, I knew I needed to buy a copy and play it straight through as soon as possible. Spider-Man 1 for the PS1 was itself a very good game, developed by Neversoft, the talented group behind the Tony Hawk games, which would 100% hold many spots on this list if I tried to include sport games. But when it came to the sequel, developer Treyarch produced something honestly mind-blowing. GTA 3 had just shown us that an entire city was able to fit in a video game, and then along comes Peter Parker in Spider-Man 2 to show us that that city doesn't have to be limited to the streets only. In fact, we could take to the skies as well. You could argue the game isn't perfect, and you could argue Spider-Man for the PS4 is a more refined experience, and I'd agree with both. However, Spider-Man 2 moved the bar and changed the landscape of what an open-world game was, right around the time that was just being defined. And it did so without endless blank or boring map space. Everything seemed full of life for the time, and while being able to maintain an excellent experience throughout, Spider-Man 2 deserves a spot on the top 10. Putting this one up high despite the fact that I didn't really play it much back in the day. Why does it deserve this rank anyway? Simply because it's Donald Duck's Quackshot. If you've heard of the game and played it, then you know why. If you don't know this game, then I'm sorry and I hope you get that fixed soon. Even playing just a few levels before I edited this video was enough to reaffirm its greatness for me. It's obvious from the minute you pick up the game that the team wasn't going to settle for a mediocre experience for fans of the original Double D. It's a game that provides challenge without being frustrating, a game that requires you to backtrack and think twice without becoming monotonous. Its presentation is top-notch, and the gameplay is wonderful. Simply put, Quackshot is a game that sets a target of excellence for itself, and it hits it square on the bullseye. Universally heralded as a classic, The Witcher series is often overlooked as a license, probably due to the fact because its source material comes from a book. Yeah, remember those? For the purists, again, I do apologize, but I've chosen to list this series under a single entry, specifically that of The Witcher 3, originally released in 2015. This is one game that is just so endlessly polished that even if it isn't exactly up your alley, it's absolutely your alley adjacent, regardless of almost any personal tastes. I think that's a roundabout way of saying The Witcher is just universally loved, and if you like video games, depending on whatever kind, you're probably going to like this one. The series, and particularly The Witcher 3, gives me the feeling of a game that's almost been built off the entire history of games, taking inspiration at least from all the adventure series, as far back as Zelda 1 and Ninja Gaiden on the NES, to more modern stuff like Dark Souls or Dark Cloud, to other entries on this list like KOTOR. It's just all mixed into one glorious package, from its seemingly endless side quests to the immense storytelling prowess it possesses. The Witcher 3 and the entire series is something almost everyone can agree is simply a gaming masterpiece. A true classic in its genre, even to this day, it's pretty amazing that The Simpsons Arcade came out during Season 2 of a show that, at the time of this recording, is closing in on the end of its 33rd season. Say what you will about the show's decline over the year, but this game itself has not lost any of the fun. You'll pick a Simpsons family member and battle your way across Springfield and beyond. The inclusion of team-based attacks is fantastic, and the stages and enemies are varied just enough to remain entertaining throughout. The Simpsons has spawned dozens and dozens of video games across 3+ decades on platforms ranging from 8-bit to mobile to arcade and nearly every console in between. But for me, the true peak will be putting a quarter in with 3 friends and playing the very first game starring America's favorite yellow family, and that's The Simpsons Arcade. Listen, say what you want about this series. Admittedly, it's gone off the rails more than once, but the original Kingdom Hearts for PS2 is undeniably a very high-quality game and a true action RPG classic. It's an action RPG in a time where so many action RPGs were just lackluster. Both Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 marked the end of an era in a way, closing out a decade and a half of top-quality Disney games, at least for the most part. No offense, of course, to Epic Mickey, which, while solid, couldn't quite make this list. Now, I do want to point out I did say in a disclaimer that I wouldn't mention any multi-license games, but I'm including Kingdom Hearts here on the technicality that it's made by Square, who directly owns the Final Fantasy series, and so I consider them to have licensed a single IP, the Disney canon, and I've decided that this game qualifies despite what some might interpret as a little mixing and matching of different universes. Universi? Sometimes grammar is confusing, and so is the plot of Kingdom Hearts 2. But whether you're an experienced KH lore master or just a beginner, slinging keyblades across your favorite Disney worlds will never not be fun. And defeating Sephiroth and Cloud in the Olympus Coliseum will never not feel good. While Kingdom Hearts 2 is also a great game in its own right, to me, it doesn't compare with the original. Some of my favorite stages include Tarzan's Jungle, Pooh's 100-Acre Woods, Aladdin's Agrabah, Halloween Town, and heck, even just hanging out in Traverse Town. I don't care who you are, that song is just plain nice. Probably not the Star Wars game you're looking for. Not the one that you'd expect to sit at the peak of this franchise on the list. I have to admit, this game forced its way into my heart. Another Sega arcade classic, and despite costing a millionaire's ransom of a full $1 to play when it first came out, Star Wars Trilogy Arcade was well worth the price of admission. Besides, that's just motivation to get better at the game, right? Up until its 1998 release, I was still mostly pouring quarters into Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, a game that was already 3 years old by then. Not anymore when I saw what Star Wars Trilogy Arcade had to offer. Not to be confused with either Star Wars Arcade, the 1993 Sega game, also playable on the 32X, or the 1983 polygonal Star Wars arcade game, also simply titled Star Wars, by Sega, published by Atari. Star Wars Trilogy Arcade from 1998 was a sight to behold when it suddenly showed up in arcades just a year before The Phantom Menace would reboot the entire IP with the prequel trilogy. Offering primarily space or vehicle-based combat that felt extremely cutting edge at the time, Trilogy Arcade also had a couple of boss fights where you donned the classic lightsaber in a battle of what essentially boils down to QuickTime events, but at the time felt like an epic space sword battle to determine the fate of the galaxy. Rough week at school? It didn't matter. Star Wars Trilogy had your back at the local arcade or your movie theater. I know a few times where I sunk probably $5 or $10 into this one, while a small crowd gathered behind to watch the fireworks and me make my way through all the stages. And while it's technically only the first stage of the game, watching the counter tick down as you approach the Death Star trench felt truly outerworldly. And even though I know the hitbox target down that ventilation shaft isn't exactly threading the needle, playing the game back then made you truly feel like you're the hero for hitting that shot, dealing the brutal blow to the Empire. Thanks for the assist, Han. Real friends will always have your back. And with this, in our top 3, we finally reached the last Disney game on the list. Simply put, Ducktales for the NES is a masterpiece. An overt influence for many classic games to follow in its footsteps since. Duck Build footsteps. Not the least of which is another classic in Shovel Knight. You'll love pogoing your way across this game from minute 1 straight till the end. Bounce and hoard riches as you make your way across the planet and even up to the moon where, no matter how many times you've played this game or heard the song, the incredible chiptune soundtrack reaches its peak, leaving me in awe of how an 80s game could sound this damn good. The remaster from 2013 is very good too, but in this case, I'm going to go ahead and recommend you just try the original, though you might want to use save states because this game is not merciful at times. The sequel, DuckTales 2 for the NES, is absolutely excellent as well if you find yourself wanting more. DuckTales the original though, it transcends its IP, its genre, its system, maybe even its generation. This is just one of those rare games I would honestly recommend to anyone that enjoys video games. Now this game is a thing of beauty. Releasing in arcades in 1989, the graphics, sound, and presentation of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 could easily pass for a game released a decade later. Yes, in my opinion, it even still eclipses Turtles in Time, despite the many contributions and improvements that game made to the franchise. Call it nostalgia glasses if you will, but the fact is nothing will compare to sinking quarters into this game along with 3 friends, standing on your tiptoes in a vain effort to hopefully see even 50% of the screen because you're all of 3.5 feet tall, but you need to play Turtles Arcade. And if you couldn't see it all, you'd just mash your jump and attack button regardless, and you'd have your time of your life doing so. In the arcades at the time, the game was simply titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but after seeing a re-release on the NES a year later in 1990, has retroactively been referred to as TMNT2, the arcade game, most of the time. Yes, even the NES box art says this. Despite the obvious many compromises made to the graphics, sound, and overall presentation, all necessary sacrifices in order to get the game to run on Nintendo's 8-bit hardware, Konami compensated generously by deciding to add 2 entire new levels, including this really cool-looking winter-esque Central Park, where you fight an alien bounty hunter wolf who throws ice chunks at you. As far as I can tell, this character doesn't appear anywhere else in Turtles lore across movies, cartoons, or comics. So here's to you, Tora. Shine on, you crazy diamond. Goldeneye for the Nintendo 64. What's left to say that hasn't already been said? It's the game that changed the FPS game forever. The level design, the gameplay physics, the movement, the multiplayer replay value, it's all ahead of its time by as much as a decade, probably more, launching developer Rare into the stratosphere of top game devs, a prestige that they would cement for years to come. The audio is also fantastic. In fact, no aspect of this game feels lackluster. GoldenEye 007 is truly a masterpiece, and if you weren't playing it when it came out in 1997, then I'm sorry, but I don't think my words will do it justice now. Playing today, even 2 decades later, the game instantly transports me back to a time where eating an entire bag of nacho cheese Doritos and washing it all down with a 2-liter of iced tea while only getting 3 hours of sleep because I was up all night playing GoldenEye with my friends was a responsible, acceptable, and dare I say, even wise decision in retrospect. Because, dear viewer, we all have a limited amount of time on this earth. Unlike James, we only live once. And I, for one, am glad that many hours of my lifetime went into playing GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64. There's nothing more than I could ask than that of any game, licensed or not. And that's why there's only one choice that even comes close for my number one, the top pick of this list. GoldenEye 007 is an undeniable masterpiece, and I'm honestly grateful for all the hours of fun I had playing this game. Well, there it is, the top 50 licensed games of all time, according to, well, me. While there are still many great licensed games being made today, they don't seem to be produced as often and with such high quality as they did in the 90s and early 2000s, which is a shame. Still, there's plenty of examples of modern franchise games, and personally, I'm particularly excited to try Jedi Fallen Order 2, TMNT Shredder's Revenge, Gotham Knights, and whatever Spider-Man or 007 games come down the pipeline next. I'd like to quickly thank all the friends, both past and present, who have sat down with me, controller or mouse in hand, and shared a moment or two of fun, whether that be via cartridge, CD, link cable, P2P, server, just making memories over a game. And thank you for watching, especially if you made it this far. I appreciate any subs and likes, but just knowing that you watched the video means the world to me. Please be well. Until next time.